experience, why you've had the executive pushing back against Parliament, pushing back against civil service, pushing back against the courts. They've been trying to accumulate more power because of how frustrated they are at their inability to do anything. But that strategy just makes it worse and worse and worse.
Be in no doubt, we are going to get Britain building again. We are going to get Britain's economy growing again. And there is no time to waste.
Together, let us fight for a better future once again. Change begins now.
Whoever I meet, I see a team of people that are ready and willing to put their shoulder to the wheel to get it done, and their government is already at work putting our shoulders to the wheel too.
But have no doubt that the work of change begins immediately. Have no doubt that we will rebuild Britain.
Well, hello and welcome back to We Are Labour. I'm Dan Grief, your host, and this is the podcast that talks everything Labour. So a bit about the history of the Labour Party, current affairs, talking very much about what's happening with the current Labour government, and we have on here members from everyday members like myself, councillors, peers, MPs, hopefully a Prime Minister one day, you never know. And today actually is not a member of the Labour Party, but of course a very interesting guest all the same. That is Sam Freedman. And I was really kind of taken back this summer when I read his book, Failed State. I really recommend it. I'll put a link actually in the show notes to go and get your own copy if you haven't already. And I thought, I really want to ask Sam, because also I listened to The Power Test, his podcast with Aisha Hazarika. Please come on the show. You're more than welcome to come on, Aisha. And in that podcast, he was talking a lot about the challenges that Labour will face coming into office. And of course, Failed State, his book talks about that as well from his experience firsthand working in one of the previous administrations of the Tories. And when I read his book, I was kind of struck by, his talk about the treasury brain that goes on in government, about the kind of lack of innovation sometimes within the apparatus of government to make things happen, and how this kind of small c conservatism can kind of stop things happening, but also the fact that things have become so complicated and so centralised that it's much harder for government to work in such a huge way. And then I was also touched by how he talked about, how our Parliament's not working in the most democratic way either, and things that need to be changed there. And so I thought, let's get Sam onto the show. Let's ask him these questions firsthand. And try to find out and glean from his words what Labour really needs to do to make a change and what would make things better for the country. And I think this is really important with what Sam's saying, that long-term planning for the good of the country is something that's really important right now, because we haven't had that for a long time. He talks about how Tony Blair really did focus on trying to think about these questions and put them right in some way, and you talk about his success. But actually, this is a great opportunity for Labour to come in a fresh way and rethink how the whole system works. Because very quickly you get used to the system that it is, and when you're in a system, you just kind of get used to that's how it's done, and you can see the frustration and you can feel the frustration. You can also see the problems, but change is a hard thing to do. And so he does talk about that. So it's a fantastic interview. I really hope you enjoy this with Sam Freedman. And check it out on Twitter. If you haven't followed us, please do. If you want to ask any questions, if you want to send in your comments, please do that as well. My email is labourpodcast@gmail.com. And please go and leave a review of this podcast on whatever app or if you're on YouTube, etc. If you're watching this now, leave a lovely comment and a review. That'd be lovely. Thank you so much for your support as always, and I'll see you next time. Now over to Sam Freedman. I'm now delighted to be joined by Sam Freedman. He was, of course, co-host of the fabulous Aisha Hazarika on his fantastic podcast about the incoming Labour government. He also, though, worked in the Department of Education as a senior policy advisor with Michael Gove, and also Dominic Cummings, I believe. So it'd be interesting to get your views on that in 2010 to 2013. So he's got lots of experience of governance and government firsthand. And of course, his book came out this year, Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How We Fix It. So welcome to We Are Labour, Sam.
Hello.
Great to have you here. Now, I've read your book. I'm actually reading it the second time over. It is one of those books that is very dense, which I've found absolutely fascinating. Can you just go through, though, your experiences first? What is it that gives you this unique perspective when you were working in the Department of Education?
I don't think my perspective was particularly unique. I think a lot of people are frustrated by the same things that I was frustrated by. I think what's unusual is that I had the time and the space to write a book about it. But I don't think that anything I say is... I think it was quite cathartic for a lot of people in Whitehall to read, let's put it that way, because I think there's a lot in there that is pretty widely felt. My own experience, as you say, was at the Department for Education. I was there 2010 to 2013. Some of my frustrations were with the specific political personnel who were with me, as you mentioned, Dominic Cummings, which was challenging. But a lot of it was just the frustrations of working in a bigger system that clearly was, increasingly dysfunctional. And I think since I left in over a decade ago now, has become more dysfunctional. So, when I decided to write this book in 2021 and then wrote the proposal in 2022, by that point, everything was collapsing. You had Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, everything was going completely wrong. So I felt like this was the moment when people would really see how bad things had got, that you could sort of make some of these bigger points.
Okay, so there must be a bit of a culture in Westminster. I'm not talking about the civil service, but also with political advisors, with politicians and the civil service, that they do know things are broken, right? But then that asks the question, why they're not changing things, I guess.
I think everyone within the system feels powerless to change it. Because, and I think that's actually quite normal in very broken systems. If you're even quite a senior civil servant, you're a cog in a machine still. You have to do what you're told by the government of the day. You have very limited authority to change the wider way in which the civil service works. But even if you're if you're a minister, you're sort of worried about your own position within the party, you're worried about the press. Even if you're prime minister, you're thinking, how do I make sure I don't get kicked out as leader? How do I keep my party on board? How do I keep the media on board? And even if you understand some of these problems, having the levers to change them isn't necessarily. They're not necessarily there either. So I think there's a huge amount of frustration from everybody, partly because there isn't sort of it's not spoken that these problems are not the kind of things that are discussed. We talk about problems with the NHS or problems with schools or taxes being too high, but we don't talk about these system problems. So everyone's aware of them at their level, but they're not seeing how the whole thing connects together, and they're not seeing how you could change it. They're just all aware of how frustrating it is.
Yeah, completely. So in that case, I kind of think you give a really good description of how the system evolved, because that's the thing about our constitution, our government, the cabinet, the whole thing has evolved over time, hasn't it? And I think it's really interesting to see how the actual nature of the state has changed in the 20th century quite significantly, so that really it's going to be quite controversial to say cabinet government maybe is not necessarily the best system of government. Is that a bit controversial to say with such a huge system that we have at the moment?
Well, I think it's what it's what it's governing over, essentially. What is it responsible for? And the issue with our central government, cabinet, number 10, etc., Treasury is not so much that it exists in the form it does, but that it has centralised power into itself. So you have a fairly small number of people, and it really is number 10 in the Treasury that control everything these days, making decisions about every aspect of people's lives. So you have a prime minister who is more powerful than prime ministers in pretty much any other country, arguably more powerful than an American president in terms of domestic policy. An American president can't turn around and say, I'm restructuring the health system, I'm introducing a new national curriculum in a year's time. They don't have that kind of power. So enormously powerful role, but also trying to be responsible for very small things as well as very big things, and it's just become overwhelming and too much, and no human being, let alone someone like Liz Truss, but no human being can do it. and so this sort of centralisation has made this very centralised executive heavy system really dysfunction. If you had more devolution, if you had more levels of government, then having a powerful prime minister, a powerful executive, wouldn't necessarily be so damaging.
Okay, so let's bring it into your story then and your experiences in the Department of Education, because you talk about how the academisation was obviously a huge part. I used to be a teacher at that time, teaching politics, so I saw firsthand some of your policies that you guys were working on. And it did seem to me like Gove came in as a kind of very much like a visionary with an idea. And, you certainly, even if you disagreed with his policies, you couldn't say that he came in just to sort of make things tick along. He definitely had an agenda and he had things to try and launch. But you then said in your book about how that, of course, then meant there was suddenly this minutiae that came your way, where suddenly small little contract details, issues within schools and school systems came to light. And so that suddenly generated way more work that was probably a much lower level than actually people in the Department of Education should be really dealing with, because it used to be dealt with by councils.
Yes, so I give the Academy's policy as an example of why centralisation happens. It's not because politicians are badly intentioned or idiots. It's because at the level of each individual example, you can always justify it. So we looked at not all local authorities, but there were some local authorities that had underperforming schools for decades, had done nothing to really support those schools or improve them, were too open to excuses about those children being from poorer backgrounds. And so there was a sense that we know what a good school looks like. If we have if all schools are academies and they're operating under a kind of very centralised accountability framework, we can sort of impose that on the system and ensure all children get a better education. And that was the motivating factor behind most centralisations. The problem is when you do it to everything, you end up being responsible for everything and you can't handle it. So the sort of accumulation of centralisation, even if each individual example was merited, leads to a position where everything grinds to a halt. And I talk about this sort of moments when we were in meetings about selling off playing fields and whether a particular school could sell off a particular patch of land. And I was sitting there with 10 civil servants and a minister, and it's just mad. This just wouldn't happen in any other country. And it's even if you think that group of people will make the decision better than a more local group could do, it's still a really bad use of a minister's time, because you need that minister to be thinking about high-level strategic questions, and that's why we never get onto those questions, because they're in meetings about playing fields or whatever. So I try and give it throughout the book. I'm trying to explain why, of course, you have better and worse politicians and different ideologies, but a lot of the time bad things happen because for well-intentioned reasons, because of the system that we have.
Okay. I can ask about your particular experience of Dominic Cummings then, because he seems like a very interesting character. Again, you disagree with his theories and ideas. He's certainly somebody who's got lots of opinions on things. How did he fit into a system like that? Because it seems to me like he almost broke the whole thing when he was working in Number 10.
So Dominic was a very interesting character, and I kind of almost use him as a counterpoint in the book, because he was very frustrated because he could see a lot of the problems that I talk about. The civil service, I have a chapter on civil service reform. There are a lot of things that make the civil service less effective than it should be. He could see the sort of nonsense of the very media-led strategy that Downing Street were following. And he could see some of the challenges around centralisation in terms of the department being responsible for too many things. But the problem with him, he almost sort of goes the other direction to me. His view of how you solve all of these problems is basically putting him in charge.
Yeah, grab more power, build it into his portfolio.
Grab more power, put it into yourself. Hire a bunch of geniuses. Who these geniuses are, no one knows, but presumably people who like him. And if only we could just get all of this power concentrated in one place, they could then fix everything and make it all work. And then you'd have a functioning state. And my view is that's obviously that actually. Not in quite those terms, but that has been what's happened. That's why you've had this kind of centralisation. It's why you've had the executive pushing back against Parliament, pushing back against civil service, pushing back against the courts. They've been trying to accumulate more power because of how frustrated they are at their inability to do anything. But that strategy just makes it worse and worse and worse. So my answer is you actually have to give away power, whether that's in terms of to Parliament to scrutinise legislation better, or to regional mayors or local authorities to deliver and build capacity in their local area. Because the more you try and centralise and grab all this power, the harder it is to actually do anything.
Yeah. Now, Okay, I've asked this of other authors, and I think it definitely applies to your book. It's one thing to have a book where you just highlight the issues and the problems. Did you have a solution to this when you started writing the book? Or was this something you've discovered as you're writing about the problems and realising, oh, hang on a minute, this would be better devolved?
I think when I was planning the book, centralisation was always going to be a big theme. I think one of the things that I learnt about more through writing it was more about the role of mayors and how the mayoral sort of function had come about, and I got to spend some time with both local authority executives and their teams, but also mayoral teams, and I've actually written another report that hopefully will be coming out in a few weeks on which is sort of a more technical version of some of that on how to develop the mayor role, and obviously, the big danger in when you start talking about devolution is you start making it out as if if you devolve, everything's going to be perfect and wonderful, and local authorities and mayors will get everything right, and they won't. They will fail. They'll mess stuff up. My argument is that even though that is true, it is still necessary because Whitehall is completely overwhelmed and can't focus on anything strategic. So you have to devolve. You have to build capacity somewhere else, even acknowledging it will not be perfect. But what I have seen in the mayors that are really working really well, like in Manchester and South Yorkshire and so on, is a level of connectivity between policy areas that you just never see in Whitehall, because it's a smaller area, because you don't have these big established departments that have learned over many, many decades not to talk to each other and to preserve their own empires. So you will talk to someone who's responsible for a particular policy, and they will naturally start talking about, they're responsible for police, but they'll start talking about health, they'll start talking about education. And you just don't tend to get that in Whitehall. Just from that, it's not necessarily that the people are better, I just think they have the scope to do their job in a different way that is encouraging. So that did make me more positive about the potential for mayors.
Fantastic. And like you said in the book as well, sometimes the solution to the problem now might be the problem in the future. So in 40 years from now, the Freedman principle will be cursed as, can you believe what he's done? He's given all these powers to these mayors who are mini dictators.
Well, and in 40 years' time, you could say devolution's gone too far, and you need to you never get no state is ever perfect, right?
Yeah.
But I do think it's hard to argue that right now we haven't over-centralised.
Yeah. Okay. So, right, I want to crack into that now. So that's a good introduction, hopefully, for people who haven't read the book. Please, though, if you haven't, listeners, go and get yourself a copy in all good bookshops, probably bad ones as well, and also online. But let's talk about these government departments in particular, because I've been, obviously, I am very skewed towards Labour. This is the We Are Labour podcast, Labour Party member, etc., parliamentary candidate in the past, blah, blah, blah. But I just kind of think that the missions, when Keir Starmer was talking about the missions, he very much, I thought, had a narrative, at least, about talking about how things can be delivered between departments. But your book, of course, does talk about the Cabinet Office, the Treasury in particular, and you call it Treasury brain, or maybe that's a used phrase by lots of people, and actually how the Prime Minister, I sort of felt the role of Prime Minister is a bit stuck, really. And actually I was going to talk about the role of the Cabinet Office in particular, and also about how Blair's tried to change that role so he did have a bit more power on the levers. So can we talk about Treasury brain first and some of the issues that a new Prime Minister would face when they come into office?
Yeah, and I think you can see this with the new government straight away, which is, they've got this theoretical commitment to missions, but where are the decisions actually being made? They're being made in the Treasury as part of the spending review, which the first bit of which will be announced on the 30th of October. And Starmer has kind of ceded control, essentially, of large swathes of domestic policy to Rachel Reeves. And I argue in the book this is a long-term phenomenon where both Number 10 and the Treasury have become more powerful. They've both kind of sucked authority into themselves. Prime Ministers have become a lot more presidential, and starting with Thatcher, and Chancellors have become a lot more involved in domestic policy decisions, really kind of starting with Ken Clarke and then Gordon Brown. But the difference is that Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, which is attached to Number 10, are really very dysfunctional and quite weak. There aren't many staff in Number 10 because it's a very small building. and the cabinet office is, whilst is connected to number 10, their relationship is never clear. Or
well, this is what I was going to ask you, because I kind of felt like when you start describing the cabinet office, I thought, I don't really, and I'm somebody who taught politics and also I follow it, religiously, and yet I thought, I don't really know what the cabinet office does. And actually you explained how it's really originally there to make collective decisions from cabinet work across departments, isn't it? So there's a collective narrative, story, and message.
Yeah,
that
I mean, the problem is
to.
it's a bit of an anachronism. It was designed when we did actually have cabinet government, when cabinet ministers would make decisions in that meeting about the future of the country. That doesn't happen very often anymore. It tends to be either the decision gets made at departmental level, or if it's at a kind of collective level, the Prime Minister will make it, or will allow the Treasury to make it. So you don't really have collective government in that sense, and yet you still have a cabinet office that was designed to support this kind of decision-making process. Really, you need to kind of accept that we've moved on and have just an enlarged Prime Minister's office, which is what Tony Blair wanted to do, but was sort of seen off by the civil service from doing that. But the sort of dysfunction and the weaknesses of this operation, this sort of number 10 cabinet office operation, means that the Treasury are much more powerful because it's a much more functional building, right? There's more civil servants, they're able to directly shadow other departments with a decent team of people. They've got more, personnel that have been around for longer, etc. They've got more of a culture. So what's happened as a result of this sort of sucking in of power into number 10 in the Treasury is actually really it's the Treasury that's holding the government strategy all the time, because they're the only people who have both the power and the clarity of belief to do that. The issue is that what they believe is most of the time, please stop spending money. And that's understandable. That's kind of the role of finance ministries around the world. It's just that we don't have any proper counterweight to ours. There's no one else saying, wait a minute, sure, we need to save some money, but we also need to spend some here, otherwise we're going to have a major social problem. And I think that's why politics has become so unbalanced. One of the reasons why it's become so unbalanced under successive governments, and you can see it again, I think, already with this government, with the Treasury just having just so much power.
Because didn't you say in your book, I'm sure it was your book, where they described the number of vaccines they had for flu, and they had an excess of them, and they're like, well, let's get rid of all of those because that could save us money. And then someone was like, well, what if you have a flu outbreak? Well, that's not our problem. We're here to save money. And that culture predominates everything, doesn't it? Because if that is kind of the starting point, that's going to be the finishing point, saving money, saving money, saving money.
And that is the culture of the Treasury public spending teams is that stopping a piece of expenditure is a win. And again, I can understand that. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have people who are thinking like that in the system, but you just have to be able to have people who can counter them. And the problem is they've just got untrammeled power to make these decisions. So you don't have any balance between someone saying, wait a minute, we don't have the money to spend on this, and someone else saying we need to spend the money on this, whether that's kind of vaccine stockpiles or anything else. And that's the problem.
Yeah. No, I just think, as I was reading your book, I honestly believe that in our lifetime, well, famous last words, number 10 Downing Street will become maybe a residence only or a place to go and do events and speeches. But it does seem a little bit insane to me that our history is, really making our leader of the country, of government, stuck in that tiny little building trying to run the country. It is a bit ridiculous. It's a very British thing to be stuck by our own history. Mind you, America, the White House, it just happens to be bigger. But it very much is a British thing that I think the history dictates our traditions. And it does seem to me to make sense to have some kind of innovation department where you've actually got the Prime Minister with a well-staffed team who've got access to that person as well.
Yeah, and again, like Blair and his Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, did have a plan to do this. They were going to take the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre, which is in the middle of Westminster by Parliament, and turn that into the Prime Minister's department, and use Downing Street for, it can be the residence for the Prime Minister, it can be where you have your, state dinners or whatever. You don't need to get rid of the history. It's a great history, but you just don't need to actually have all your people running the country in like a little rabbit warren rooms in there, because it doesn't make any sense. But it never happens. And, Dominic Cummings actually also wanted to do that. Theresa May Theresa May's chief of staff, Gavin Barwell, kind of wanted to do that. It just never happens. There's always something else that gets in the way. So, but it just seems like such an obvious thing to do. I don't think maybe when people are in there they quite appreciate how much it's harmed their ability to do things until they get out. But it is a very obvious little thing you could do.
Yeah. Now, I just want to go through, of course, the roles of Richard Wilson, who doesn't live too far from me, so I want to get on the show one day to talk about this experience up close, and Jeremy Hayward, and this kind of relationship, because that was really an insight to me. I didn't know this stuff at all. So, can you explain how these reforms and the way that Blair was trying to run things, and how different and how it did kind of free up his time to be a bit more effective as a leader, but unfortunately did kind of regress again, I think, in 2010, and also Jordan Gordon Brown's time.
Yeah, so Blair and Jonathan Powell had all of these plans to dramatically transform the role of the Prime Minister, getting rid of the Cabinet Office, moving to this sort of new building, etc. None of which happened because the Cabinet Secretary, who was Richard Wilson at the time, kind of blocked it from happening. But there was a compromise deal kind of reached, which was that they would expand the functionality of Downing Street by adding these units. So you had the delivery unit, which was initially run by Michael Barber, who's actually just been brought back by Starmer to look at delivery again. You had a strategy unit, which was run by Jeff Mulgan, and who later worked as, I think, wrote the 2010 manifesto for Labour. And you had the policy unit, which had previously existed under previous Prime Minister. So rather than just one team who always got sucked into firefighting, you had three teams. The delivery unit could spend time actually focusing on very specific prime ministerial priorities, and the strategy unit could focus on longer-term thinking. And this did work better than anything before or since, but it was still pretty limited because you still didn't have very many people. It was still in this very kind of centralising mindset. The kind of Michael Barber way of doing delivery works for a very specific target. If you want to get waiting lists down and you have a Prime Minister who's engaged and a team who are good, you can do that from the centre, but you won't necessarily fix the deeper problems around, say, a shift to greater prevention in health, or or shifting money from hospitals to community care and things like that. So it was kind of the best we've had, and it was still pretty limited, which is why I sort of say Prime Ministers often look to that kind of Blair era as being, the best it ever was, and wanting to return to it. And as I say, we've seen Starmer rehire Michael Barber already, but even that was very limited. So we have to go much further and shift power out of Downing Street, is my argument.
Okay, and then I just want to take that to another part of your book, talking about social media, and the news cycle is very different. So I think one of the benefits that Blair had was his very early days of 24-hour news was coming around during his time in office, whereas nowadays news stories are being broken by blogs, by Twitter. I refuse to call it X as well, by the way. And these other mediums have come up, and of course it means that it's a bit crazy. Actually, I think social media 10 years ago was in such a romantic sort of place in our minds and hearts that this is going to somehow democratise conversation and debate. But actually, it has kind of meant that we are serving it, and that it seems like governments are always running to firefight things rather than necessarily have the time and the space to be able to plan ahead for the future.
Yeah, and again, like, this is a section of the book that I think very few people in Westminster would disagree with. That this sort of impact of firstly 24-hour news, then the internet, then social media has been to speed up the news cycle to the point where it's essentially continuous. So you don't really have any time to make a decision. If you sort of imagine back to when Blair started, which was the year BBC 24-hour news got going, but wasn't really a big thing. So really still at that point, you'd have a BBC journalist or a newspaper journalist ring you up in the morning for a story they were going to run that evening on the 9 o'clock news or in the papers the next day. So you'd have a day to make up your mind and say, we're going to refute this story, or we're going to confirm it, or we're going to make a policy decision that gives us something to say. Now it's on Twitter before you know about it, right? It's live, it's news before you even are able to make a decision. And then the moment you're not saying anything, from the point it's on Twitter or the internet, you're under attack. So
and that silence is almost seen as being very loud as well, because your silence is somehow guilt, or
they still haven't commented on this story. They must be panicking. So your ability to then make a rational decision is really compromised by this sort of incredible pressure of this news cycle. But it also creates this desire to pump out announcements all the time.
Right, the English baccalaureate. That's one of them, right? Because I was a teacher at the time. I was there when I actually saw this coming in. And, of course, I was a history teacher in politics, so I was part of that. But then my RE colleagues were pretty fed up that they weren't. But I was kind of surprised when you described how that announcement was made, and then the name was chosen to please Guardian readers, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's this is a great example of how this kind of announcement culture leads to worse policy, because there's this sort of tradition that in the first week of the school year, there's an announcement or two about schools.
They're crumbling, they're falling down. Yeah.
Well, so you need to make an announcement. Back in 2010, Michael Gove was booked onto the Andrew Marr show, needed an announcement. We had this kind of idea for something that would look a bit like what the English baccalaureate became, but we hadn't really worked it through yet, and it was rushed out, in a few days of work so that he had something to say on that programme. And that, I think there are good things about that policy, but there are also things that could have been better, and it certainly wasn't introduced in a way that was well received within schools. It could have been so much more effective if you hadn't had that pressure. But there's always this pressure to announce in order to feed this beast, this incredibly sort of fast-moving news cycle. That if you don't fill with stuff that journalists can write about, they'll write about something attacking you. And actually, again, like we've already seen this with the new government, Labour this time around have not been feeding the beast particularly as much as normal. They have been doing it a bit, but less than usual. And we have seen a lot of stories about Starmer's expenses and all of this kind of stuff, and Sue Gray, and they start to write about process because they haven't got an exclusive announcement to write about. And I saw in the papers yesterday, one of a sort of unnamed Labour source saying we need to be filling the grid more. And I was like, well, this is exactly what I was talking about in the book. This is exactly the problem that you get into. You think the only way to deal with all this negative coverage is by announcing stuff, which leads to worse policy, which leads to a position where you're under more attack and you're under more stress, and you go around in this sort of negative circle. So it's already happening with this new government.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I'm just reading on Leading by Tony Blair. It's been released really recently, and he talks about this problem with putting politics before policy, and it's always the other round. He said, if you put your policy first, and then it's the politics of how to sell that. But if you start with the politics first of how to sell something, and then work the policy out afterwards, it's always going to be worse. It's always going to be a poorer process and deliver poorer policy in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's the system that we now have, and I think I've called that chapter how communications ate policy, and that's how it feels to I think most people working there, is that comms it's driven by a comms need, and then you sort of build the policy around that, which is completely the wrong way around.
Yeah. I've got a lovely quote here, actually, by Bill Clinton. He said, I find if you spend too much time a day playing defence, especially against very sort of personal sneering attacks, you're losing even if you're winning. I thought it was great. If you think you're winning the argument every time by defending yourself, you're still losing, because the opportunity cost is massive.
Yeah,
a president or a prime minister should be focusing on the next 5 years or so. And actually, that you do talk about that as well. The election cycle is a bit of a problem as well, right? So even if you have got a prime minister who's thinking further ahead than 5 years, they've got an election before that time, and that's also going to dominate their thinking, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's inevitable that's going to happen, and that does happen in any democracy to some degree. But when you add that to the problems of the media cycle, to the problems of being so highly centralised that you've got a small number of people making all the decisions not properly scrutinised, you can see how these bad incentives do worse things in our system than they do in other systems.
Okay, now a name I'm going to come on to next, Chris Grayling. What a guy! I remember the
Lord Chris Grayling to you.
Sorry, Lord Chris Grayling. I was genuflecting when I said that, listeners, I promise. But he was an interesting guy, because I think in a way he kind of epitomised to me a lot of the Conservative government's ideology in privatising everything, procurement as a government, buying in services and privatising what you can. But in your book, you talk about an OnlyFans person and a pornographer. This isn't me trying to get brownie points by proving I've read your book, by the way, Sam, but I really have enjoyed it. Can you tell us about the OnlyFans situation, the pornographer, and also some of these decisions that Chris Grayling took, and how basically we have kind of privatised profit and socialised risk?
Yeah, so this is a chapter on sort of outsourcing and privatisation, and it flows from the chapter on local government and the destruction of local government. So the argument I'm making is, because the capacity of local government has been so destroyed, it has created a gap where you need someone to deliver services, and the market, this private market, has stepped into that gap. And in some places that's worked, in a lot of places it hasn't, because actually a lot of public services are too complex to easily contract out to a private sector provider. Like if you imagine you've got a cleaning contract, that's actually fairly straightforward. You know what you want a clean office. There are lots of companies that provide that service. If you get a rubbish one, you can replace them fairly easily. There's no real risk for the state. If this goes wrong, you just bring in another company to do it. So, and indeed, it has been discovered that the process of outsourcing cleaning contracts does reduce costs. So it's not a sort of complete anti-privatisation or private company chapter. But when you get a system like probation, which is what Chris Grayling tried to privatise, Lord Chris Grayling of somewhere, Lord Grayling of hell probably. He tried to privatise probation, which is an incredibly complex system. They made an absolute shambolic mess of the contracts. It was a disaster. A lot of the companies went bust. Some of them reduced their service to such poor levels that they were given the worst possible rating by the inspectorate. The department had to renationalise it, very expensive. It's still a complete disaster zone because this process of privatising then renationalising has led a huge number of experienced staff to go, and all of this kind of thing. Classic example of trying to do this in a way that didn't work. And then you get to the sort of OnlyFans lady who's running a children's home, and I think children's homes are probably the worst example of this sort of phenomenon, where it used to be the case children's homes were run by local authorities. Over the years, they have not been given the funds to essentially build new homes or buy new properties for homes, and have increasingly therefore been reliant on private providers that they pay very large sums of money to take children who need residential care. And actually a lot of these are run by big private equity companies who are making an absolute fortune out of it. But you have got examples where it's just totally inappropriate people running it. So you had a woman who was on The Real Housewives of Cheshire and an OnlyFans star, and Pika Pixton, and she's married. She was the partner of David Sullivan, who's the owner of West Ham, but also made all his money in pornography originally. And they were running and financing a children's home, and it was found to be inadequate by Ofsted, and I think it is still closed. And
that's kids' lives. That is serious. Right. This is the thing with all government decisions. You can talk about it in the kind of abstract and the theory, but actually it's actual people's lives being hugely affected by it, being failed by the state.
Right, and that's a sort of particularly eye-opening example, but there's a lot of very poor quality children's homes, and even if they're run relatively well, because companies are trying to make money out of it, what they do is they buy up cheap property in parts of the country, northwest, etc., that are cheaper to purchase property, and then you get councils in London having to ship kids 300 miles away to live somewhere in a completely different place. This is, as you say, it's children's lives, and these are the most vulnerable children in society. So it's pretty horrendous.
Absolutely terrible. And then just on that note, then it made me think about regulation, because that, of course, is a huge part of the government's role now, isn't it? Regulating different industries. I run a business in the food industry, so we have food standards, and we have to adhere to the regulations. How much is that costing in terms of effort and money to try and regulate so many different parts of the economy, so many parts of society? Because we just talk about, quite flippantly, I think, get the regulator on it. We've seen with our rivers and streams the problems that have happened there. So this must be a huge part of government minutiae work as well that they are doing.
Yes, there's been this kind of massive expansion of regulation as a result of a lot of things being pushed into the private sector that then need to be regulated in a different way. And you can see it with the water industry, with the electricity industry. And I think there's a kind of belief, certainly amongst people who have a nice sort of ideological commitment to markets, that regulation is easier than public ownership. And it doesn't necessarily follow that it is. And so you actually get a lot of the same problems that you have with public ownership, just in the form of a regulatory challenge instead.
Yeah.
So just to give an example, from the water industry, you've got a regulator who's trying to figure out how much are these firms allowed to charge in terms of bills, how much are they allowed to spend on infrastructure. So they're essentially dictating what the firms are allowed to do anyway, but they're doing it with less control than if you were just running it in the first place, because they can't quite see exactly what these companies are doing in terms of their accounting and so on. So, yeah, it's we should have learned over the last 30, 40 years that the state is actually not... regulation's really hard. It's not an easy option compared to either public ownership or other forms of state management. So, and part of the problem is that they've got so big and so complicated that ministers who are there for 5 minutes aren't able to get their heads around it while they have the job.
And also, who do you recruit to be a regulator? I mean, I imagine people from the industry, but the industry can probably pay a hell of a lot more than the government can. So
it can, yeah. So you get revolving doors, and anyone good at the regulator goes into the industry, and it's all they will know each other. So you also have this sort of problem of industry capture.
Yeah,
which
it's a real
which
problem.
Is a risk too.
Okay, now let's move on to this executive dominance that we have. And I think it's very interesting what you said earlier on. I just want to reflect on the idea that the Prime Minister has more power than the President in terms of the actual pulling of levers in government domestic policy, not in terms of resources. But it is interesting how our parliamentary system has evolved. If you look at when you teach constitutions, you can generally see that most states have had a restart point, or they've come together to decide how their constitution will work. Ours, on the other hand, is kind of an evolved system where power has come from the king to Parliament to the Prime Minister to, the executive has a lot of control. And it made me think about when you talked about MPs and where they're coming from. And I kind of know quite a few MPs who work incredibly hard. I know they're not seen as being hardworking by the public, which is unfortunate, particularly post MPs' expenses. But they're kind of like local social workers, national legislators, representatives who write on behalf of their constituents to everyone to try and influence things. It's a particularly hard job, isn't it? And it's not really set up now as it was originally. So they are kind of really there not to legislate, but like you said, move towards the power is like a moth to the light. So
yeah, I think a big problem with our constitutional setup is that, as you say, if you're becoming an MP, the two reasons that people tend to become MP are either because they are very attached to their constituency and want to be a constituency MP, or they want to be a minister. You don't become an MP because you want to be a legislator. And
that's a problem, isn't it? Because I talk to peers who do an amazing amount of scrutiny of policy in the House of Lords, and they've said to me privately, that the Commons just doesn't have time for this. There's just no way that MPs have got the ability to...
And they're not given time either, right? So one of the reasons why no one would become an MP to be a legislator is that you don't have any power to do it properly. The government can ram stuff through the Commons very quickly, as long as it's got a majority. The bill committees are pretty pointless usually. You might be on a select committee, which might give you a bit more authority, but select committees are still very limited in the powers they have and what they can do beyond sort of writing reports. So it's very different to being like a senator in the US, where those committees have enormous power. If you're on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, you have a major role in informing and shaping American foreign policy. That's not really true for those kind of MP roles here. Yeah, so I think it is a real problem. And then you get a lot of crappy legislation going into the Lords. The Lords has more people who are able to then sort of try and repair it, but they don't have any power, so you're then very dependent on the Commons accepting your amendments, which they might not do. And also the Lords is getting more like the Commons in the sense of being more heavily whipped, having more political appointments who are expected to vote the party line, etc. So I argue in the book this is one of the reasons why so many policy decisions are ending up in the courts, is because you're essentially getting worse legislation because Parliament is broken. That can then be judicially reviewed in the courts. Often courts, usually courts will rule with the government. They're pretty conservative, but small c conservative. But increasingly they will rule against the government. We've had some very big cases like the Rwanda case in the last Parliament, or the Brexit cases around prorogation and so on. And it's not ideal to have the courts that involved in politics. They're not elected judges. But they've become a kind of constitutional backstop to the fact Parliament isn't working. So, we need to get Parliament working, basically.
Yeah, I remember reading about the right reforms and thinking what a big change that was, that the MPs themselves had a lot more control over who was the chair of the select committees, etc. And then Daniel Zeichner, when he came onto the show, was talking, this is before he was a minister, before the election, he was talking how he found that being a shadow minister for DEFRA was incredibly hard because he wasn't resourced very well at all in terms of his research, and his team was done by his team, and that was it for his area and building the relationships. The Select Committee, on the other hand, has civil servants producing fantastic reports, and yet at the same time the Select Committee doesn't have any power. And I find that bizarre. The person who's going to step into the job doesn't really have the access to the resources until they're in the job. The Select Committee does have the resources. They don't have the power to make much change. And I think in many cases for the general public, they wouldn't even know these Select Committees didn't exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And it would be quite easy to make them more powerful. I mean, you're right that we have seen some positive reforms. They're now, you have to get elected onto a select committee, which is a big improvement, rather than it being the whip's decision. So it's become more independent. Chairs are paid, which makes the job more attractive. So those are good things. But, you can't subpoena anything, right? You can't, if you're on that DEFRA select committee and a water boss doesn't want to come to the committee, they don't have to, and you can't make them. If you want a particular document that they've got, you can't force them to hand it over. If you think that a bill going through Parliament, as a committee, you think a bill going through Parliament is terribly wrong on something, you can't, as a select committee, commandeer any parliamentary time to discuss that. So there are lots of ways you could make them stronger and sort of create that kind of legislative role for MPs. Great.
Right, so I want to talk a bit about the civil service, and in particular, because I know you talked about this kind of the Yes Minister, by the way. That's the programme that's influenced many of us, hasn't it, I think. And it, of course, it's a wonderful programme, but in itself, it is a piece of propaganda too, isn't it? It was very much kind of written towards what Margaret Thatcher wanted. It was very much trying to represent the civil service in a way that was useful for Thatcher at the time. In fact, she even appeared on it. That, by the way, that is the worst sketch I've ever seen ever. That banning economists one is just awful.
Yes.
But let's just talk about this. It's kind of based in that gentleman civil servant, the Northcote-Trevelyan report you talked about, and how it kind of its roots are still very 19th century, right?
Yeah, so the civil service was built sort of out of the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms. Before that, you had a situation in which ministers essentially hired people that they wanted to do a favour for, they wanted to give a salary to into jobs, so that was not merit-based in any way. The reforms were about making the civil service merit-based, but the way they did that was by creating a set of kind of exams that and an entrance process that was designed for young men from Oxford, essentially, to be civil servants. Now, of course, over time it has democratised and diversified somewhat, but that kind of initial model of a senior civil service that's quite disconnected from delivery, who are all generalists, has remained, and that was the kind of joke of Yes Minister, was that you still had a civil service that was like this, and obviously
the joke of Boris Johnson, he goes around quoting myths all the time as if that's a common parlance thing,
right? And obviously, whilst it was exaggerated, there was it was based on true stories. Yes Minister, from the Wilson administration. And what governments have done since then to try and push back against this old-fashioned civil service is by just disempowering it, essentially, by making it weaker and weaker, by making it easier for them to undermine senior officials, fire them in sort of extreme circumstances, and made them less willing to offer impartial advice. And this is my argument, is that they've done this rather than proper civil service reform, which is a lot harder. They've just weakened it, and what you need is a proper to return to a proper impartial civil service who feel they can offer advice to ministers while serving the government of the day, which is their job, but can criticise privately when it's appropriate to do so. But in order to do that, you actually have to engage in the kind of reforms that a lot of people from Harold Wilson to Dominic Cummings have talked about. Bringing in more specialist expertise, making people more accountable. The quid pro quo of that is you probably should pay them more and give them more authority, delegated authority. But these are these things, these ideas have been around for a while. They never happen because rather than actually do the hard yards of reform, politicians just say we're just going to weaken you a bit more.
Yeah, and if it works and I can get my stuff through in the term that I've got, then at least that's my achievement, whereas the system itself isn't. Okay, and then the last point on that then, the role of SPADs has become massive. They're saying that I spoke to Anthony Brown on election night, because that was my constituency, where I was helping our candidate, and I asked him why was the election called when it was, what happened at D-Day with the Prime Minister leaving early, and just all these decisions seemed crazy. And he said effectively that he was surrounded by a team of very clever people, too clever by half, and I imagine he was talking about the SPADs, because I can't imagine civil servants would say that's a good idea, Prime Minister, this is just not what you should do. And we know that he had about 40-odd SPADs around him, I think, didn't he? And the role of the SPAD has become bigger and bigger, but of course, who are they accountable for, and what are they saying, and who are they saying it to, and is it reliable? Is this somebody just speaking for themselves, or on behalf of, is Ed Ball speaking on behalf of Gordon Brown, or is he speaking what he's saying? And this is a big problem as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, it's like this classic British constitutional development where SPADs arose because from the Wilson era onwards, because you had prime ministers who wanted and ministers who wanted more political support, and that is not unreasonable, but the role never was formally properly defined, and so you've had this kind of expansion where SPADs are sort of almost in this kind of weird grey space where they're almost treated like ministers in some cases. Certainly Ed Balls was, and Dominic Cummings was, but they've never been elected and they don't have any formal power beyond their sort of appointment by the Prime Minister. And it sort of really muddied the water of what traditional civil servants are supposed to do. Are they allowed to offer advice that hasn't gone through a SPAD? Some departments they can, other departments they can't. Constitutionally speaking, that doesn't sound very proper, but there's no rule that says a minister can't say you must go through my SPAD first. So, it's just another example of where we've created sort of ad hoc solutions to problems rather than clear ones that people can follow.
And I guess the SPAD answered the problem, which has now caused the problem. Like you were saying in your book, this is a cycle where the problem comes from a solution previously. Yeah. So I want to get into the positives now, because I feel like I don't want the listener now at this point to think, oh my word, you may as well just move to Ireland and just start again somewhere else. Because actually, can we just go through these different examples and think, what is the biggest thing that should be changed, do you think? Where is the biggest kind of change that's going to be the low-hanging fruit to make the biggest difference?
I'm not sure any of this is low-hanging fruit exactly, but I think the big change, the one that I think Labour are most interested in, perhaps, or the one they're pushing on initially the most, is decentralisation. I do think they are willing to consider a big expansion in the mayor role, and an expansion of mayors to all parts of the country, and I think that is a real positive. So I think in terms of that part of the book, that started to happen under the Conservatives. I think Labour will take that idea on. I think it's a real cross-party consensus now. It's a good thing, which is really good. And I, as I say, I've got a report with some more suggestions on that coming soon. The ones I'm less convinced that they will do, but I think they should do. I think the power of the Treasury needs to be countered. And I would love to see Starmer using his mission boards as a counterweight to the Treasury rather than just ceding complete control, and using them to develop policy with the Treasury, not as a battle, but not exclusively by the Treasury on spending. Not sure that's going to happen. And I'd love to see the Commons fixed and MPs given more power to scrutinise government. I think it is quite unlikely that will happen, which is a shame. Though I'd love to see moves in that direction too. So those are the big things that I think you could and to complete those tasks would be big deal. But there are there are things you can do quickly to start on that journey. So devolving a few more things to mayors, giving them a bit more clarity about their funding, giving select committees a bit more power, etc., etc. So you can make a start on that journey quite quickly.
Excellent. I think, though, with regards to devolution, I guess the other side, just to be careful, is, I mean, in Cambridgeshire, where I am, we have had a huge amount of devolution. So we have mayoral combined authority. And by the way, I'm just going to quote from Anthony Carpin, who himself was an ex-civil servant, and he made this fantastic Venn diagram to show the complexity. We've got the mayoral combined authority, you've got the Cambridgeshire County Council with the district councils underneath. You've then got the Greater Cambridge Partnership, which is set up between certain councils and the University of Cambridge as well. You've got the Business Board, the Local Enterprise Partnership, the LEP, and then you've got a unitary authority with Peterborough. So you have this very weird system where, and it's not surprising that voters, they don't know who the hell's in charge of anything, because they'll get told, oh, that's not actually part of this council, that's that council. Oh, that's the combined authority who deal with this. That's the Greater Cambridge Partnership who deal with that. So I guess it has to be done in a way where, and maybe that's where the mayoral model comes in, because at least that is a strong local executive who would have a lot more control. I guess it's about control again, isn't it? But at least it's a lot more, like you said, regional, and that would be better than maybe having too many bodies locally.
Yeah. So part of the challenge I think the new government will have is in kind of tidying and consolidating some of this up, right? I think they've see the mayors and councils as being the kind of main units, but then you've got all these other kinds of bits of infrastructure lying around from previous eras, and you've still got parish councils and multiple levels of councils in other areas. So there's a question as to how much time do they want to spend tidying some of this stuff up, rather than just sticking another layer over the top. And your mayoral combined authority has been one of the least effective, I would argue, precisely because it is so messy. Whereas you compare that with Greater Manchester, which just has 10 unitary authorities, is much simpler.
Yeah, and also one of the biggest problems surely is that you can give power locally in terms of spending. So councils become very good at just being given money by the central government to spend it as they wish. But it's the tax raising locally that's probably the biggest change, isn't it? Because as you were saying about the levelling up funding, there are councils who spend, like, they get professionals in, they probably pay for consultants and they train their staff up to apply for funds, and then they find they can't get access to them. They can't get the levelling up funds because they've already had it, or they filled the form in wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, this is another one of the big questions for the new government is, do you allow for more fiscal devolution? Do you say that you'll have local taxes? We are very, very unusual in essentially all of our taxes being decided on centrally. And that means that even if you give mayors more power, as you say, they will be supplicants who can get credit for getting money. When they don't get money, they can say, well, it's not my fault. So it creates this very uneven relationship.
Nicola Sturgeon, that's kind of an argument throughout the whole time, really, wasn't it?
If you look at Scotland's really interesting from this point of view, because I think there's lots of reasons why the SNP have become less popular over time, but one factor has been from 2013 onwards they've been given tax raising powers, which means they've had to make some decisions, right? And they have put up taxes and they've spent some of that money. So she and her successors have not just been able to say it's all Westminster, because they have this power to raise more money. And I think that has led to more scrutiny of them, as it should. So I do think it's an important part of the picture.
Yeah, okay then. So I was going to ask you now another question about Labour and this current government. What are your fears about Labour coming in? Because this is a fresh chance. I mean, I'm not talking about from the point of view of Labour, but any new government coming in from a different party is a real fresh start, I'd say. Do you think this is going to happen? Do you think that Labour's got the initiative and the drive to sort some of this out?
Look, I think, as you say, when you get a new government in, you get people who've got more energy, more desire to do the right thing. I think the Tory government had kind of died by the time they were kicked out, and they were almost kind of glad to be given the boot, because they just completely run out of ideas. So it's definitely an improvement. They have come in, I think, a bit undercooked. because I don't think until about a year out they were expecting to win. And I think they are also in an incredibly difficult situation. And don't need to tell your listeners about the sort of scale of the financial challenge that they face. There's a lot of very broken things, and a lot of sort of voices pushing them in one way or the other. So it's a very difficult position to come in on, and I think they are a bit undercooked in terms of the development of their ideas, but they've been there 2 months, so I'm not going to judge them yet. I want to see how things develop over the next year, and how they respond to some of these challenges, and whether they pick up some of the challenges I talk about in the book.
Yeah, great. And actually, you know what? It's not even a partisan point. We need our government of whatever colour to do well, don't we? Because it's beneficial to all of us.
Which is why I'm always willing to work for any. I'm not a member of a party myself, but I'm always willing to work with any government, because ultimately we need these things to start improving. Whoever is in power.
So I could ask you that about just you now. So I'm going to use the expression. I could be wrong. You seem to me like very much a policy wonk type than a political person, right? So you would work for any party, like you just said there. Do you think that politics itself is sometimes a problem? It's not just the selling of the idea, that it drives the idea, and that can be, or the lack of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I am a policy wonk. I'm not tribal. I wouldn't necessarily work for any party, but I would always happy to speak to anyone and help if I can. But I think what I try and do when I'm writing about policy, which I think is probably the thing that makes me quite unusual, is always bring politics into it, because you can't understand the scope you've got for making policy change unless you understand the political incentives that are acting on governments. And I think there's a lot of really well-intentioned, very smart policy analysis that doesn't take politics into account and therefore always fails. So, there's been 150 reports on why we should have more spending on prevention in healthcare. But until you understand the politics, you'll never understand why that doesn't happen, and you'll never, the argument itself is obvious, but the reason it doesn't happen is the bit you need to tackle. So, you can't separate policy and politics. I think with me, it's just that I'm not an instinctively very tribal person, but although I'm glad that people are, because we do need parties, otherwise our system wouldn't function. Yeah,
totally. And then what are you working on next, Sam? What's your next? You said you're doing a report at the moment, is that right?
So I've just finished a couple of reports that hopefully will be coming out soon. One on education, one on mayors and devolution, and then I am hoping to do a bit on a new book project, which I will keep quiet for now, but I want to write a proposal for another book, because I really enjoyed writing the first one, and I'll keep doing my Substack as well. Yeah. And
the Power Test podcast, of course, that was very much set up to try and talk about Labour getting ready potentially to come into office, and then, of course, they did. It's a shame that it had to end, but I guess that was the natural ending point of that podcast. But
yes, and we might bring it back in some form. We haven't decided yet, but
please do. It's a great podcast.
It was very much about that journey to power. So if we do bring it back, it'll have to be with a different question.
Yeah, and just want to apologise now. I've totally stolen the question about the fantasy cabinet that I asked my guests. So I just want to say thank you for letting me have that. Well, Sam, I just want to say it's been a massive privilege for me to be able to spend this time with you, and what fantastic answers. And I think, there is hope there as well, isn't there? That actually, if we can all see there is a problem, then that's probably where the political will comes from everyone to decide this has to be better than this. So I just want to say to everyone, if you want to go and get that book, Failed State, Why Nothing Works and How We Fix It, that's out by Sam Freedman. It's in all bookshops. And thank you for coming on the podcast today, Sam.
Thank you very much.
This wound, this lack of trust, can only be healed by actions, not words. I know that. But we can make a start today with the simple acknowledgement that public service is a privilege, and that your government should treat every single person in this country with respect.